So take me into the cell now. So for people that don't know what mitochondria are, I think it will be a very helpful primer. I've talked about it a fair amount on the show. Longtime viewers, listeners will have heard me refer to it as the powerhouse of the cell, but your book goes into details much more than that. Why do people think it's a powerhouse, and why do you think it's far more than that?
So mitochondria, being the powerhouses of the cell, is based on the fact that mitochondria take most of the food. They're really the only utilizer of oxygen in the human body. Like we need to breathe. We need to breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. That's mitochondria. Mitochondria are using that oxygen and churning out carbon dioxide at the end of the day. They are doing the processes that result in that. So this is really fundamental stuff to living organisms. It defines life itself in many ways. And there's no doubt mitochondria are powerhouses. They do those things. But the research over the last 20 years, primarily in the metabolic health field, but also in the aging field. So researchers who are trying to figure out what causes premature aging, how can we slow it or delay it? There's been an explosion of research on mitochondria and all of the functions they do. Some cancer researchers are highly focused on mitochondria. And then in the neuroscience and mental health fields, this dates back to at least the 1980s. In the 1980s, we had the first mitochondrial theory of autism. And in 2000, we got the mitochondrial theory of bipolar disorder. And since then, we've had mitochondrial theories of lots of chronic mental disorders. But it also applies to things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. So quick summary of, well, what else do mitochondria do? They are primary regulators of neurotransmitter production and release, including key neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin and GABA and glutamate. They are primary regulators of steroid hormone production and release. So this includes cortisol, estrogen, testosterone, progesterone. They are primary regulators of inflammation. They play a direct role in turning it both on and off. They are primary regulators of epigenetics. In fact, one study found that they are responsible for the expression of at least 60% of the genes from the cell nucleus.
Mitochondria?
Mitochondria. So mitochondria are producing lots of the signals that play a role in the function of cells. So mitochondria are producing something called reactive oxygen species. Mitochondria are producing ATP, but they also play a role in how much ADP and AMP are in the cell. Those levels, the levels of ATP to ADP to AMP, play profound roles in cell function and cell health and gene expression. Mitochondria play a role in the levels of calcium in a cell. Calcium is important to turn cells both on and off, also plays a role in gene expression. Mitochondria are the primary regulators of calcium levels in a cell.
Yeah. So first of all, this is such a radical. No.
I'm getting too nerdy.
This is incredible. We're actually going to keep going deep, but I had never heard anybody talk about mitochondria as being that multidimensional before, and I've really looked into this stuff. And so this is part of what freaked me out reading your book. Is you're very clear in the book. I'm not saying any of this stuff for the first time, but I'm the first one pulling it all together. And so I had never heard of mitochondria talked about as anything other than you've referred to it as a power cable. You usually hear about it called a battery, but I thought that was interesting. So they are the power cable. But you said that's actually not the most accurate way to think about them. If you're going to use an analogy, use the analogy of a motherboard in a computer. And that's when I was like, what? Like I've just never heard that before. So once you begin understanding the like way back history is we at one point were a single-celled organism that consumed the mitochondria inside of the cell. So when you think of mitochondria as like its own living thing with its own DNA, it is its own bacteria that's you've taken inside the body, and you begin to understand, are we really humans as we think about it, or are we this fascinating collection of bacteria? And when you begin to understand that from your microbiome to the biome on your skin and your mouth and inside of your cells, you have all these different bacteria doing all this different stuff that have intelligence, might not be the right word, but that's where you begin to realize, oh my God, now I begin to understand how it could be possible that all these very disparate things, which don't feel like they could be connected with my layperson's brain anyway, just they felt too disparate, that once I understood how much mitochondria is involved in, that if you begin to break that machinery through diet, and we're going to need to go into why that ends up breaking it, because I actually don't understand that part, but then it's like, okay, if this really is the motherboard and you do something that disrupts the motherboard, now you understand why it will sketch out your entire personality. And that blew me away. I did not realize, even to the point where, and this I think is what you were just saying, that mitochondria themselves will produce hormones, but they also have receptors for hormones. So they're like communicating to each other with all of these mechanisms that I think I represent a lot of people, in that I imagine it still in that homunculoid way, where there's like a guy in my brain, and my brain is like dictating all these functions. When in reality, it's hyper distributed. It's happening at the level of cell, and they're communicating back and forth with these different messengers. Is that all accurate?
The one thing I'm going to correct is that diet is the primary or only factor that can harm mitochondria. So the most important message that I want to make sure people don't come away with is that Chris Palmer is saying poor diet is the cause of all mental illness.
How are you not saying that? This is so interesting.
I'm not saying that at all. And at the same time, I am saying diet plays a powerful role in mental illness. Diet plays a powerful role in mitochondrial health, but it is not the only thing that plays a role. The reason that is so critically important is because I can think of hundreds of examples in which people might develop a mental illness completely unrelated to diet. Somebody could be traumatized. Somebody could have a horrible, traumatic, abusive childhood. Somebody can have a hormonal imbalance. Somebody can smoke cigarettes. Somebody can do hallucinogens, lots of hallucinogens and marijuana, and develop a psychotic disorder. Those things none of those are diet related. People are consuming other things, or other problems are occurring in their body, and they can develop chronic, crippling mental disorders as a result. Women, hormones, postpartum everything, postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum psychosis, postpartum mania. Those are real things. It's not because women changed their diet. It's not because women started eating more carbs at the end of their pregnancy, or somebody gave them a box of chocolates and they ate those chocolates, and that is what caused their postpartum psychosis. It's not that simple, and we can't make it that simple. The reason this theory is so overwhelmingly exciting to me is because, number one, if you understand the science of mitochondria, you can understand all of the symptoms of mental illness and all of the associations that we have known about for decades. You can begin to understand neurotransmitter imbalances, hormonal imbalances, gut microbiome issues, all sorts of things, underactive, overactive brain regions. So by understanding mitochondria, you can understand the phenomenon of mental illness, but much, much more importantly, or equally importantly, I guess, equally importantly, is when you look at all of the things that can adversely affect mitochondrial function, like the things I just mentioned, they're all well-established risk factors for mental illness. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is mitochondrial dysfunction ultimately is the cause of mental illness. And if you ask the big picture question, well, what causes that? Diet is one of the things that can cause it. And I'm happy to go into the details and weeds on that if you want, but it's not the only thing that can cause it. Trauma can cause it. Alcohol use can cause it. Marijuana use can cause it. Poor sleep can cause it. High levels of stress, hormonal imbalances, insulin resistance, all sorts of things that we know play a role in mental illness are known to directly impair mitochondrial function. And that can result in all of the metabolic and mental disorders that we know of. So if you can take any one of those risk factors, childhood trauma, people who have a lot of trauma in childhood are more likely to develop a mental disorder. Which one? All of them. All of them. It's not just post-traumatic stress disorder. They're also more likely to develop depression, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, alcoholism, opioid addiction. They're more likely to develop every mental disorder.
Was that